Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 758. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. Today, Jeffrey Miller and I have been trying to coordinate a time for an interview on the topics of tribal knowledge and team playbooks since August of 2022, nearly a year ago. We finally solved that problem. Teams generate knowledge. Understanding how to hold on to that knowledge and to push boundaries forward is why teams are powerful. Jeffrey Miller is a senior consultant at Manifest Solutions in Columbus, Ohio. Jeffrey has over 2 decades of experience helping organizations bring value to their mission through software. He has presented a variety of topics at local user groups, regional tech conferences, and national healthcare meetings. Jeffrey and his wife, Brandy, are adoptive parents and have written a fun children's book called Skeeters, with proceeds supporting adoption. Learn more about the project at skeetersbooks.com/adoption. Are you ready to understand tribal knowledge? It's time for the interview. Jeffrey Miller, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be here.
Jeffrey, we've been talking about doing this interview and perhaps a number of other interviews for, it feels like forever, but it's only been a year.
Yeah, not even that. Last August, I think.
We ran into each other. I think we were actually sitting at a table at the Path to Agility in Columbus, Ohio, weren't we?
Yeah, I think you were in my session, and then we shared some lunchtime conversations as well.
That was probably my first and last time that I ever had a Choco Taco, since I think those got killed right after that. Your session was on tribal knowledge, and I was really impressed by the whole idea. I hadn't thought much about it at the time, and it really struck a nerve with me. Why don't you start with what is it? And, let's just start with what is tribal knowledge?
Well, tribal knowledge is knowledge that is known within a group of people or the tribe, the insiders, and it's unknown to outsiders. And a lot of that is because it's never written down. It's just communicated within a team, and it's hard for outsiders to learn.
Is that generally in one person's mind, or is it truly somehow spread across the entirety of the team?
Well, if you're lucky, more people know about it than just one person. But every time we do activities, we create new knowledge, and then it's up to us to share it amongst the team. But a lot of times what happens is the team fails to capture it or share it adequately. So that's been a real challenge.
Why is this an issue with Agile teams especially?
Well, a lot of people say that Agile does not espouse documentation. And if you look at the Agile Manifesto, it says, while we value the things on the left, we value the things on the right more. And the thing on the left was comprehensive documentation. And so people take that as meaning that we don't want documentation at all. And that's just not true.
Though I must say that having been in this business for a little while, I can remember the days when I was doing a job up in Ottawa, Canada. And my boss and I were reading a design document that had 29 separate 3-ring binders. Wow. It was, and it was a firm fixed price deal for $168 million. And it's like, I think they're going to have troubles. But so wow. I understand the difference between just enough documentation and comprehensive. But if we learn something, how does a team, tribe, group, anything that we want to call it, how do they then hold that in their memory for any length of time?
That's a great question. I know that I have a terrible memory, so, I have my own challenges getting things captured. And it's almost like a bottleneck, just my brain getting to paper or to documents. You have a lot of ideas and thoughts that you want to capture, but it's hard to get it out. And then when you get into situations where you've got people meeting together and there's only so much time, it's hard to make that concerted effort to capture the essentials. Teams can barely have structured effective meetings. How can they, have effective documentation if they can't even meet well?
Right after I listened to your talk on tribal knowledge, I started looking at a concept called transactive memory. And it's, more of a networking effect, where one person, and everybody knows that it's one person, has this piece of knowledge. And so therefore they can draw on it. And I was looking at it from the point of view of Scrum Masters, right? They knew how to do all of the wonderful ceremonies, the Scrum ceremonies,
right.
But nobody else really had any of the nuances. They remembered what a daily Scrum was, but they had none of that nuances because it was all locked up in that person's head. And lo and behold, what happens when that person leaves? And hopefully they do, right? They get another job or they hit the lottery.
They retire, they get promoted. They move to another team where they're needed more greatly, or heaven forbid, they get spread across to another team or 2 or 3 or 4. The Scrum Master that's doing 4 teams. I think I listened to that podcast that you had lately. Might have been not a Scrum Fundamentalist column or something.
Yeah, that would be Susan Parente. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you've got anti-patterns there. Anytime you lose a person, they could be on vacation. They could go to their favorite comic book conference, and then something falls apart, and you're like, I hope you had fun on vacation, because we certainly didn't while you were gone. So, there's a lot of circumstances where the loss of knowledge or the lack of it, lack of sharing, can really cause problems. It can cause waste. Like if you're waiting for answers, you can have to do things over because someone may not know about existing solutions, or they may do it twice. It's not just the rework because we screwed it up. It's the rework because we did it twice, and now you have 2 different versions of something. So I know that when I was at my last client, we had ServiceNow. I don't know if you've dealt with ServiceNow very much, and ITIL. Yeah, I can see on your face you're very familiar with that.
Yes, I am. I know ServiceNow.
Teeth gritted. Yeah, so I've read The Unicorn Project, and I think Maxine Chambers was a great embodiment of things that people know, but they don't share. She'd file a request and it would get denied because you didn't submit it to the right person. It's like, well, can you route this for me, please? Poking around in the dark in these big systems, it's hard to get the answers that you need. So that's another big deal.
If we know that tribal knowledge, obviously has some value, otherwise teams wouldn't, or groups of people wouldn't fall into that pattern. But in general, if we know that it has significant weaknesses, why does it hang around? What is it that really is the other side of that economic benefit that says, hey, we better hold on to this information and not tell anybody else?
Well, it's similar to tech debt in a lot of ways, because it's always the important but not urgent thing to do. And it's hard to find that sweet spot where you have just the right amount of documentation and the right kind of documentation. Alistair Coburn, in one of his podcasts on IT Conversations, you may remember that one.
Yes, I do.
Talked about, how ugly of a problem it is, because you've got this finite set of resources, time, money, priorities, against the potential to document anything and everything, and you can't really do that. So finding that sweet spot is tough, and he spent some time thinking about that. So he had some suggestions for that, and if you apply some techniques, you can actually, not go overboard. He talks about putting it on the backlog. Make the documentation need a user story just like everything else, and then it has to fight its way out. It can still get cut, obviously, but you're at least making it front of mind, and you have to prioritize that. Well, the other thing that he really pulled out there is that sometimes the best form of documentation is not paper at all. One thing that I took from his suggestions many years ago is that sometimes the best form of documentation is have 2 engineers in front of a whiteboard, and one starts drawing out the design, the other asks questions of it, and you record it all on video.
The whole idea of pairing and mobbing, the reality is we probably have done a lot of that forever. Your idea of putting 2 people in front of a whiteboard and recording it, The recording is probably new because that's easier these days. But the fact that two people got into a session in front of a whiteboard, working things out and having a conversation, that's been around for a long time.
Oh, sure.
But now it's significantly easier to capture that so that that information doesn't go away. I'll be honest with you. I think watching somebody have a skull session in front of a whiteboard might be interesting for a while, but I think that would be brain deadening for after a while. But I mean, you could run it through some sort of an AI and capture all the words. And all sorts of things. So we are in a position where we can capture documentation as a normal or part of the basic doing of work. What keeps us from doing it, though? Because you and I, we both know that whether it's transactional knowledge, one individual, tribal knowledge, sealed up in individual teams, over and over again, at least I run into that kind of stuff in my world.
Well, I think part of it is it's twofold. One is the lack of the pain of being on the downside of not having that knowledge. And the other is lack of empathy because of that. So if you've ever been in a situation where you've been the victim of not knowing and not being able to do the right thing because nobody told you the right thing to do, then suddenly you're like, oh, that's important because I've suffered through that. And if you've never suffered through that, then it's hard to go, oh, this is important. It's kind of those leadership things where you have to ask yourself, who have I not told or who am I leaving out? And if you've never gone through that, then you don't really identify with it.
The whole idea of failing, at that level of empathy says that we are still struggling with the whole idea, the whole concept of teams then, because I think that basic form of empathy would really be a base level of team.
Yeah, you certainly have the notion of team agreements. And I think part of what needs to be built into team agreements is more than just the question of what's our definition of ready in an agile setting or what's our definition of done, right? You either have to incorporate has it been documented into the definition of done, or you have to tack something onto the end to say, hey, are we still thinking about this the way we should?
What do we do about this? I mean, we've thrown out some suggestions in terms of, making sure we capture that, making sure we record it, have empathy, those sorts of things. How else would we tackle this problem?
Well, one of the things that I use as a tool or a way to think about this is what I call a knowledge playbook. And what that includes is a lot of things. You have reference, you have lessons learned, like from your retrospectives, you have situational guidance, checklists, templates, all these things. And if you start with a knowledge base, make sure you start capturing things like capture things that come through an email. I can't stand email. I'm not very good at it. I won't tell you how many digits my unread message count is, but you can probably guess. But we get this information transiting by all the time, and you look at an email thread and you're like, what are they even talking about? And then 14 responses later, you're trying to sort out what you're doing, and suddenly your executive function and mental energy levels are just taxed to the point of you can't even deal with it. So that's where I find myself a lot. And so I'll do things like assign categories of knowledge base onboarding to my email. I'll send it to OneNote. The last team I was on, we used OneNote pretty faithfully, and it was a nice change. One of the things that I figured out is I'm not the best person to organize a knowledge base. Surprise, surprise, here I'm talking to people about it at conferences, and I found someone else that was even better than they were actually doing the right way, whereas I was just, soapboxing about it. So there's a lot of things that you can do. And I think people, when they think documentation, they may not think of it. They think too statically about it. They're like, oh, it's a Word document or it's something like that. Whereas if you start building things like tools that help facilitate your work, you can start embedding the knowledge into these things. For example, templates. I've used email templates for, hey, we're doing a software release, and here's the big announcement that we send to all of IT saying, hey, this has happened on this date, and here's what's going in. Those frequent, or even infrequent, both deserve attention, so the things that you do too seldom to remember, or the things that you do so often that you want to save yourself time. Templates can help there too. Checklists. Atul Gawande has the book Checklist Manifesto. Have you read it?
I can actually put out my hand and probably, if I leaned over just slightly, grab it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's one of my. I was going to bring that up. That is very definitely one of my favorite books.
And actually, the book that you recommended to me at that conference, Monotasking by Stefan Notenberg. I don't know.
Yeah. Close enough.
Close enough. Yeah, I figured I messed that up. I was able to get the 2 dots over the O when I was searching Google, at least. So, but his book cited some of the same information that Atul Gawande had mentioned, and the checklists, they come in 2 forms. One is a read-do checklist, where you do each step one at a time. You read it and then you do it. The other is a do-confirm checklist, where you do your work, and then at the end of a certain phase of that work, you look over this list of things to make sure you hit all the items. And I learned the hard way that you need to use the right one for the right reason. We had an ops team a few years ago where when we did our releases, they would often screw up the sequence of things, or boot something up before they were supposed to, or forget to do something, and then we'd have this issue arise. And we tried to give them a checklist for it, but we tried to over-specify it in a read-do way, and they were like, no, we're not doing this at all. Had we done a do-confirm style, I think we would have done better with that. But that's a really good book, and I've actually given it away each time I've given this talk. I like to have a copy with me, and I'm like, hey, door prize at the end. It keeps some people's attention a little bit longer. So.
Oh, that's a phenomenal idea. Having a method of capturing knowledge, and then obviously it can be searched. There's a lot of other things that you can do with it. You mentioned onboarding, and I think that's unfortunately I've lived through, or I haven't lived through it, but I've actually been coaching teams that were bringing new people in, and watch them struggle through trying to, I guess, do the Vulcan mind meld and get that stuff in there. So how would something like the Knowledge Playbook actually work in onboarding?
So in onboarding, the biggest thing is it needs to be enough to get people caught up with where you are. That's another Alistair Coburn notion, is that you don't have to document everything, but you at least need to document enough to where people can catch up with the rest of the team. Something that I like to do is have them document the setup. Like if it's a development team, we've got the document for the last time somebody set up their environment, but now we hand this off to the new person and they have to set up their environment. They're going to find problems. They're going to find version incompatibilities, or, hey, this doesn't work like you wrote it down. And that's good, because that's a learning opportunity for them. And they can be the ones to update it. That could be their first, entree into the team.
Who owns this? How does this, so if, let's say someone decides to go down the path, or a group, whether it's a team, a community of practice, something, they go down the path of capturing information so that it's not transitory, it can be shared, all of that, all of the right things to do. That means somebody actually has to do that. How does a group actually make the decision, and do they go out and hire somebody to be the archivist, or?
Yeah, there's usually somebody that's the anal retentive person on the team that actually cares about it, and they might be the curator or the librarian, but it does take a team participation, and that was a refreshing aspect of the last team I was on. We actually did a pretty good job of it. And because of the structure that some of the other members of the team had added, it's kind of like the stone soup metaphor where the story is that these soldiers come in during a famine. They've been away at war and they don't have any food, and nobody wants to share their food with them because it's in such short supply. And so they make this big production of a pot of water in the middle of the town square. They throw in some rocks, and then people come by and they say, "Oh, what are you making?" They're like, "Oh, it's stone soup. It's going to be really good, but it would be really great if we had some carrots. Man, wouldn't that be great?" So everybody pitches in all the stuff that they have, and it's a classic children's tale, but I think it captures something along the lines of group participation. And if everybody adds something in, then they start to see the value. And if it's part of the team alignment, team agreements, that we have this as a resource, then I think you're in a better position.
Interesting. Have you ever actually used that metaphor, the whole idea of stone soup, to talk to adults?
Quite a number of times. I don't know. I think a lot of them had heard of it as children, but.
How did that go over? I mean, I really like the idea, and I'm just trying to parse through my head how I would actually use that. I mean, I remember it as a story as a kid, right? So,
yeah, and I think it kind of engages that nostalgia along with communicating how the result as a group is better when everybody participates. And so if you can kind of give them a way to identify with, hey, you know what, I can pitch in too. One of the things that I like about wikis is that you can put links to nowhere or links to things that you want, and then someone else can come in. And, if they click on that link, then rather than here's the information, they're like, oh, look, here, now you can add it. And they're like, well, I'm not the person that knows it or whatever, but it's open by default, and you can start to build that out from like a most wanted content perspective. And if you start to put little hooks in there that say, hey, we're missing this, but you can add it, that's their opportunity to contribute that knowledge.
As a punchline, you've used this, it sounds like, personally, and when you gave the presentation last August, there were a smattering of things in there from both your teams and in personal life. How often do you see this approach to breaking down, those sort of closely held pieces of knowledge that are so transitory and capturing them? How often do you see this actually working?
Well, my assignments vary in duration, depends on, I'm a consultant. And so it just depends on timing and what work I'm doing at the time. And, I work in software development teams. So, I might be on a team for 6 months. I might be on a team for, 2 or 3 years. So I've seen different levels of buy-in. Part of it depends on team size. If you get 20 people versus, 6 people, it can vary that way. It's herding cats if you've got 20 people. But then if you get enough critical mass behind the adoption of a knowledge base or of just the notion that you need this knowledge captured, then it's a lot more effective. So part of it depends on how long I'm there. The last assignment that I was on, we actually created a portal for the rest of IT related to the tools that we oversaw. And suddenly we're not just creating content in our team, we're creating content for consumption by the rest of IT.
Wonderful.
Yeah, as soon as you do that, you start to build that momentum, that critical mass behind it. We chose a static content management system, and I was able to suggest that, and then our team started really getting behind it. So in that case, it wasn't us documenting it for each other, but we were documenting it for a much wider audience, and that was really successful too.
Have you ever seen the concept fail?
I would say so. I mean, I think that, it depends on the team. I worked for a team where there was a tech lead that really wasn't helping the team out. He would go in on a regular basis and sling code around and then tell the rest of the development team that he broke their tests and didn't seem to care. It was just awful. And one guy
And nobody slashed his tires?
in my head.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it was unpleasant. It was certainly a dysfunctional environment. So
Yeah, it sounds very dysfunctional.
yeah, depending on the team and who's in charge and how the team dynamic works, you can see some varying outcomes. Some successful and some not. On that same team, we had one developer join the team from another team. Speaking of onboarding, and he worked for like 2 to 3 months on some feature. And at the end of this 2 to 3 months, he merged in his changes, which is an anti-pattern in itself. And he was called on the carpet because he was using techniques that were newer than the rest of the code base. He was using the latest, greatest features of whatever framework. And I determined at that point, I'm like, that's not his fault. That's the team lead's fault. He should have been looking at this, doing review, knowledge transfer, that kind of thing. I think of the Fibonacci sequence. I think that there's up front, you need to have a fairly frequent review interval. And then as you establish trust and understanding, you spread it out more and more. But, 3 months without even, quote, onboarding him into the tech stack, that seems like a big fail there.
That sounds like a huge failure. Jeffrey, if you woke up tomorrow morning, somebody handed you a cup of coffee or whatever your caffeinated beverage of choice is and a magic wand and said you had 2 wishes, any 2 wishes that could solve this whole tribal knowledge thing, what would those 2 wishes be and why?
Tough question. Now, this caffeinated beverage, do I get to drink it first, or do I have to answer right away? Just kidding.
I think I would drink it first.
Oh yeah, sure. I think if I had a magic wand, I would try to bridge that gap between the understanding the need for capture, organizing it later. I mean, you'll get there. That's the next problem after you capture it. But just the sensitivity to what the pain of not capturing it and not managing it is. Whether it's knowledge loss, introducing defects, or those type things, compliance issues, security issues. Those are important and they're significant. So if I could just get team buy-in, and why this is important, that would be the first one. The second one is probably improving practices around team sharing. One of the things that I talk about is we always talk about deliverables as being code, and in the sprint review we demo the feature we built. We're like, hey stakeholders, here's what we built. But when does documentation get elevated to the same level of importance as the code that we wrote? It's not that it's the thing that's running the business, but if the team doesn't get informed about it, then it's kind of like the tree falling in the woods, or in this case the dead tree falling in the woods, if you're talking about documentation. So
yeah, good point. Jeffrey, how would people continue the conversation? How would they find out more about you? How would they find out more about tribal knowledge?
My website for this topic is knowledgeplaybook.com. You can go to the About page. It's got my information, how to connect with me, my Twitter handle, my LinkedIn information. It also has other things that I've done and been a part of. I'm a children's author, so you'll see information about the children's book that I wrote. It's about a gang of mosquitoes fighting Wendell for control in the backyard, and it helps support adoption. So shameless plug there, but Knowledge Playbook.
That's a good plug.
Yeah. So it's a fun read. It's probably best for about 3 to 7 years old, and part of the proceeds help support adoption. So there's that. And then if you just connect with me on LinkedIn, that's a really good way to reach out initially.
Anything else that you'd like to promote? The platform is yours.
Well, I mentioned the children's book. The next conference season, I hope to put this out there. There's also, I recently did a podcast about building a second brain. Tiago Forte has a book about that, and that's another thing that's capturing my attention lately.
I do want to loop back on that. So we're going to do another interview and discuss that. I've been reading more and more since you intrigued me about that. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is what's missing in my own practice about not being good at organizing the knowledge base. It's really helped me implement some new things. So I'm looking forward to that.
Jeffrey Miller, thank you for spending time with the Software Process and Measurement Cast listeners.
Thanks, Tom. I enjoyed it.
In Reread Saturday News. By the way, we are getting close to the end of this reread. Ideas for what's next? Start shooting them to me. Part 3 of Team Topologies, Organizing Business and Technology Teams for Fast Flow, integrates team interactions with team topologies. In Chapter 7, Team Interaction Modes, the authors define 3 basic interaction patterns. Link in the show notes to this week's reread in the Team Topology reread series. In the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 759, we will feature an essay, building on our essay from SPaMCAST 757, which challenged the commonly held Agile belief that constant collaboration is a silver bullet. We will use this belief to explore critical thinking. We will also have a visit from Case Kostecki, who brings her perspective of being a Scrum Master in a complicated environment. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?